Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, Roger, we're talking about history, specifically the history of the DC Universe. Even more specifically, the new history of the DC Universe. So, this was a 4-issue series that was collected into this hardcover volume that came out quite recently. It was sent to me by a friend with a note that said, "I hope this makes DC continuity less confusing." Does it? Well, let's talk about it. So, DC Comics history and the continuity of events in the DC Comics universe is notoriously confusing. It's virtually incomprehensible. You itching over there, Zorro's itching because just the thought of DC continuity makes him itch. So yes, it's notoriously confusing, the history of the DC universe. Which is not surprising because this is a universe of characters that has existed for 90 years. So you've had these characters around for a long, long time, and a lot can happen in that time. And what has happened has been a series of reboots and reimaginings, which has made the DC Comics universe, the history of the DC Comics universe, very convoluted and confusing. Once upon a time, back in the Silver Age of comics, they had an explanation, for why the Silver Age comics and origin stories were different from the Golden Age, and that was all the stuff that happened on the Golden Age happened on another Earth. You see, there were multiple Earths, and every one was just a little bit different from the others. And all the Golden Age stuff happened on one Earth, and all the Silver Age stuff happened on another. And that was introduced in The Flash and then in the Justice League. And, it made sense enough. It at least answered the question. But after many years, DC Comics decided to do Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was a major event, the first real major comic book event of its kind that involved every comic book that DC printed. This was a major event that revamped, restarted, and rebooted all of those things, Roger, the DC Universe. Basically wiping out history and making a new history. And it was supposed to simplify things for new readers, It didn't, really. Superman was restarted by John Byrne. He came over from Marvel. And he was a little easier to follow because, John Byrne started basically at the beginning of Superman and just went from there. Batman, it was a little more vague. Wonder Woman was basically restarted. A lot of other characters and groups, who knows? And that was the problem. And they knew it was going to be a problem. So right after Crisis was over, they came out with a history of the DC Universe written by Marv Wolfman, which did not answer all the questions, but attempted to. And of course, that history became seriously out of date because Crisis was a success. It did really the main thing it was supposed to do, which is bring in new readers to DC Comics. It worked. It worked for me. I joined... I didn't join, but I started reading DC Comics right around that time. I started reading Superman when John Byrne came over from Marvel. I was a Marvel kid. But I became very interested in the DC Universe right around that time in the mid-'80s. But because Crisis was so successful, every few years you had every year basically you had some kind of event. And every few years you had an event that revamped or restarted the DC Universe either in a small fashion or in a large way. And so things became quite confusing. And then we had the New 52 in 2011, which completely restarted everything and made everything different. And then we had to go back to kind of how it was after that. It's confusing. So I can see the necessity for something like this. This was written by Mark Waid, a comic book writer who claims to have read every DC comic book practically. He's a big fan of DC Comics. And I guess if you're going to get anybody to do this nowadays, it would be him. And so what he had to do was to come in and decide, okay, what happened and what didn't happen in the DC universe. And this has different artists doing different sections of the book. And that is a little inconsistent, but for the most part, the art in this book is really good. It just, there's Jerry Ordway there. So you have different artists in different sections. But Mark Waid writes the whole thing. And the central conceit of the whole thing is that Barry Allen, the former Flash, at this point in time, Barry Allen is no longer the Flash. He will be the Flash again, because that's how it works. But at the moment, Barry Allen is just hanging out, retired. And he decides, I've been everywhere. I've done everything. I've seen everything in the DC universe in multiple timelines. I want to straighten this out, and I want to write a history of the universe. For him, it is a history of the universe. And so, that's what he'll do. So Barry Allen is the one that's writing this history. It's written from his point of view, which you could do a lot with, and they don't really. So one thing you learn right away is that Barry Allen doesn't know how to write a history, because this is not a history, really. This is a chronicle of events. This is one thing after another thing after another thing, and this character showed up, and this character showed up, and then this character showed up, and then this thing happened. That is not a history. A history not only tells you a sequence of events that happened, but it examines those events. It interprets those events. It goes into some detail on why things happened, and not just how things happened and when things happened. There's a lot more to history than what you'll find in this book, but Mark Waid didn't have the space to do that. So it's basically just a chronicle of events. And unlike a history, by necessity, you have no dates in here. So you don't know when anything happened. You can't, because this history has to last as long as it possibly can, So there are no dates, which becomes a problem in that you don't really know how much time has passed between the events they're talking about. Some things because, World War II is mentioned in events that we know when these things happened in the real world. But all the non-real world stuff, you have no idea when it happened. So, you've got that. So it's really not even a proper chronicle. But the art is real pretty, and it does tell you, from the very beginning, okay, these are the things that happen in this universe. What this is basically trying to do is tell you, okay, this happened, and everything else that we don't mention, maybe, but, this stuff happened. Okay, so when you're reading DC Comics nowadays, this is the history of the comics and the characters in those comics. And, it's, from an artistic point of view, it's pretty good. It starts at the very, very beginning. I will give you a sense of it by just reading this first part. In the beginning, there was the source, the infinite force of creation. Its cosmic agents, celestial beings called the Hands, shaped its energy into the Big Bang that we know as the dawn of time. Perpetua, one of these beings, entrusted the multiverse's three realms, matter, antimatter, and dark matter, to her sons, the Monitor, the Anti-Monitor, and the World Forger, before being banished for attempting to meddle with creation. The Big Bang gave rise to the stars and planets and the endless, 7 powerful entities who each represented an aspect of this new reality. Among them were Destiny, Death, and the Dream Lord, master of his realm, the Dreaming. So we're starting in grand mythological fashion, and it just kind of goes on from there to tell you the different events. I won't go into them all, but Mark Waid packs as much in here as he possibly can. And, you know, that's cool because it does tell you, okay, these things happen, but he doesn't tell you much about the things when they happen. For example, let's go to this period here with his cool ship. John and Justice Valor, the heroic black pirate and son, sailed the seas, as did the Caribbean's Captain Fear. Andrew Bennett, a minor English nobleman, was cursed with vampirism, yet for the next 400 years defended humanity against the cult of the blood-red moon. In a dark part of London, Richard Swift endured a ritual that caused him to absorb a mysterious and magical shadow power. Under several aliases, including the Shade, he traveled the world, sometimes as a hero, sometimes as a villain. Frankenstein's monster, who later took the name of his creator, escaped captivity. Decades later, his nomadic existence eventually led him to join the Superhuman Advanced Defense Executive. Wow! Okay! And it just goes on like that. Page after page after page after page. So this happened, then this happened, then this person showed up, and this person showed up, and then these guys showed up, and then this happened, and then that happened. Okay, so as a reading experience, not the best. It's a timeline written in narrative form for most of this. And Mark Waid's decision making as far as what happened, what didn't happen, it's understandable. And I could kind of get where he was going. So basically, he loves the DC universe. So basically the question is, hey, did this thing happen? The question is usually yes. Everything happened, except where events conflicted. And unfortunately, in the DC universe, that's a lot, man, because you have multiple origins of characters. How did the Justice League actually form in the beginning? Who knows? There are 4 or 5 different origins to the Justice League. Which one is true? He has to decide that. And inexplicably, he decides to go for the New 52 origin of the Justice League. And, yeah. But there are lots of questions like that you have going in. When did Batman and Superman first actually meet? You don't actually get that in the history part of this. But that's a question because there are multiple accounts of that. And so every time there is a conflicting story, Mark Waid has to decide, okay, which is the actual story? But he manages to pack a lot in here. So a lot of this cool stuff in the DC universe has been restored that was, destroyed by Crisis and later events. Probably the biggest example is Superboy. Superman in the Silver Age of comics began his career as Superboy in Smallville. But when John Byrne took over Superman, he wiped that out. That history was gone. And here, he was Superboy again. Cool, because now that makes the Legion of Superheroes make sense. Which for years and years, it didn't really. Because Superboy was integral to the origin of the Legion of Superheroes. So he put that back in, and he put a lot of stuff back in. And that's cool. But at the same time, still a lot of things we don't have answers to. One question I had in this is about Supergirl. She died during the Crisis. She came back later. In this, it's very vague how she came back. And before that, there was a different Supergirl who was originally called Matrix because she was an alien from another dimension, another universe, who took on the form of Supergirl at a time in the universe when there had been no Supergirl ever. Did that character still exist? It seemed like she would have to because she played a part in the death and return of Superman, which is history in this. But in the actual narrative section of this book, you don't get an answer to that. However, at the end of this book, let me flip to it, you do get the new history of the DC Universe timeline. And so this is a much more detailed timeline of what actually happened in the DC Universe, with actual citations from different comic books going back from the 30s. that'll tell you, okay, this is the new official timeline. This is the series of events that happened. So basically, it's the history. It's what this is, but in a much more detailed fashion. And you will find answers here that you do not find in the actual history itself. I found the answer to Supergirl. Yes, that version of Supergirl did exist. Although you get the sense that she existed a bit differently here going forward than she did when she actually showed up, which would have to be the case because, it's too much has changed in the universe since then. So this is extremely helpful. It still does not answer all of your questions. There are going to be questions that you have that this does not answer, including how the hell did all of this stuff happen and how long has it taken? Again, there are no dates in here, so you don't really know how long time spans were between the events chronicled here. How old are our characters? How old is Batman? You would think he would need to be at least in his 40s because he's had like 5 Robins or something. And all of those Robins, they're all part of this history. They all existed. So did he have like a Robin a year? Who knows? And so you have questions like that will not get answered. You cannot answer the question really, how old is a character, because these characters can't really age that much. They have to always be eternal. Steve, when he does his version of this video, will talk about the Stanley virus and how that infected DC Comics and how that ultimately led to this. The curse of strict continuity in comic books. I understand and appreciate why this was created. I think they would have been better served if they had made this differently. So this was 4 issues of basically one thing after another. And reading it as a straight narrative, if you read this from beginning to end, it makes your brain reel because it has to chronicle all the different events that changed history over time. And some of those are quite convoluted, and these are like thumbnail sketches of them all. So yeah, it can make your head reel reading this book from beginning to end. And then you have this at the end, which just is a more detailed version of what you just read, but more valuable. So if you want to actually know something, this section is going to prove more valuable than the history itself. What I think they should have done is made a 12-issue series that was an actual comic book story, and you could have done it from the perspective of Barry Allen, the Flash, and he could have zipped through history or whatever. It probably would be more entertaining and, a bit more fun than this. Like I said, the artwork is good, but the actual reading experience is not so great. And this still leaves a million questions unanswered, although they do their best. If you are going to use this as any kind of reference at all, you will never use this section of it for that. This is just the pretty pictures. This back section, the actual timeline, is what you would end up referring to. And there are gaps in this and holes with questions unanswered. And don't kid yourself, this will be out of date in 5 years. Probably. By 10, certainly, this will just be, completely out of date, But for right now, it's interesting. Mark Waid did make some interesting choices. He made a lot of good choices as far as what happened and what didn't, and some choices that are seriously questionable. But, that's the way it's going to be if you try to do a project like this. It's interesting. And yeah, there you go. That's the history of the DC Universe. I'm not sure I have anything else to say about it. I will catch you next time.